Here's the topic tonight. So, can a machine have a mind? Right? And so, we love talking about this, right? So, you don't have to look very far. All sorts of characters in science fiction and television shows, and obviously, this is a topic that people love. So, from HAL, the computer in 2001, Commander Data, the sentient android in Star Trek: Next Generation. That's Rachel from Blade Runner, and what is this? Ava from Ex Machina. Sunny from iRobot, and then if you're watching Westworld and addicted to it like I am, they're the hosts at Westworld. So it's a fun topic. But asking this question, can a machine have a mind, has more value than just the entertainment value. What I want to talk about tonight is the way that it has great value in terms of helping us think about the brain and think about ourselves. Now, to be clear, we don't know the answer to this question. It's an instance, though, I think, where the journey is as important and interesting as arriving at the destination. And so that's what we'll be talking about tonight, is that journey. Now, just want to say a couple things about what tonight's not about. So, we don't have to fall into the trap of that debate. Is the brain a computer? It's a computational organ. It's not a computer. Yes, kind of no, not that much. This isn't about artificial intelligence per se, the ones that we think about. Super fun topic to debate. What does it mean that nobody can beat Watson in Jeopardy, or that Deep Blue beat the world champion Garry Kasparov in chess, or now apparently even computer programs can beat the world champion in Go, the game Go, which was the hardest of all the games to solve computer program-wise. I'm really interested in exploring tonight the topic of could a machine have a mind like ours? Not one that can do artificial intelligence things, but I mean a mind. I mean a sentient mind like ours that we would feel compelled to interact with and give rights, because it's too much like us to ignore that. All right. So I want to start with a question. I want you to think about this question. This is going to be a theme tonight. I'm going to be asking you to explore some questions in your mind. So this is the first. I sometimes, for fun, teach a class like this at UT. It's called Building Brains. You got to call it something. But I like the first class period. I give them this topic and they have to write on it. And I want you to sit and think about it for a second. Now, there's a reason it's expressed in the negative. Will it always be impossible for a machine to have a human-like mind? The reason for that is I don't want you to get hung up on thinking, well, we'll never understand the brain enough, or computers will never be fast enough. I want you to assume that there are no limitations that way. Assuming no limitations like that, the question is, will it still always be impossible for a machine to have a mind like ours? Okay? So I'd ask you just for a second to explore that in your own mind. We're going to come back to it in a bit, and it would be good if you've thought about that answer a bit for yourself. I have my own answer. That's not important. Again, one of the ideas here is the journey and not the destination. So one of the ways that we're going to deal with this tonight then is that I want to employ a surprisingly powerful technique in science called thought experiments. So thought experiments are experiments that we can't do or that we don't do, but nevertheless can be informative. Just thinking about the experiment, imagining how it would be done, imagining what the results might look like, can be surprisingly useful. So, for example, Albert Einstein famously used he was very good at this. Is one of the things he was famous for, is using visual thought experiments. And so, for example, special relativity, his theory of special relativity, he says came to him imagining what it would be like to ride on a beam of light. He knew from experiment and from Maxwell's equations that we always measure the speed of light the same, no matter what's going on. He imagined if I'm on a beam of light and I have a flashlight and shine it, the beam of light would travel away from him at the speed of light, and yet he's going the speed of light. And it was that thought experiment that made him unstick on the idea that space and time are fixed and land upon all these equations then that eventually allowed him to show that space and time are relative, that they have to be, that depends on your frame of reference. Now, we're not Einsteins, we don't have to be, but we can use thought experiments like this to think about the brain. Right? So I want you to return now to this question that I posed. Will it always be impossible for a machine to have a mind? We can use this as a thought experiment. So imagine what your answer was. So here's the thought experiment. If your answer is no, I think it will be possible for a machine to have a mind, then you can start asking yourselves, well, what would it take? How similar would that machine have to be to your brain for that to work? How different could it be? So explore that way. If your answer was yes, it will always be impossible, then you can imagine then, well, what is it that I have that the machine can't ever have? Because that's the secret ingredient for perhaps about how to have a mind. Now, let me ask, because this happens a lot with the UT undergraduates that take this course, how many of you felt compelled to parse that in your head a little bit? Like, yeah, but not emotion. Or maybe, but no free will. I don't know, but how many of you kind of had to divide it up in your head a little bit, that it wasn't precise? Right, so same thing now. So the part that you think could happen, well then that must say something about what you believe. The part that you think a machine couldn't do, why couldn't a machine have emotion? So then we could ask, well, how is it that we have emotions and a machine can't? So that's the idea of some thought experiments. And what I'd like to do then, the goal of tonight is that I want to lead us through a series of thought experiments to help us understand our own brains by imagining, could a machine have a brain? All right. And so let's start with philosophy of mind. Okay, so a great place to start on this question is to launch into one of the great philosophical debates, philosophy of mind. This is René Descartes. You're probably familiar with him. You remember he was famous for Cartesian coordinates. He's a famous mathematician. If you had Cartesian coordinates in middle school, his fault. He's also famous, and this is what we'll talk about tonight, he's famous for Cartesian dualism, a theory of a philosophy theory of mind, and that's what we'll talk about tonight. But what's interesting is that in that regard, we think of him as a philosopher who set out to build a foundation of philosophy of mind. That's actually not what his goal was. So as it turns out, in addition to being talented in the ways that he was, Descartes was a deeply religious man. And he set upon himself the goal to build an argument that would be unassailable and that would prove the existence of the soul and thereby the existence of God, in his words, with such rigor that even scientists would accept it. Okay, now, so as a mathematician then, his strategy would be he needed his axioms. So the mathematics, you start with some axioms, some things that just have to be true, that you're just going to accept as true. And then you use those axioms to build some theorems, and then some more theorems. And then if enough work and time goes by, then you can use mathematics to prove all these things, assuming that your original axioms are true. So Descartes went looking for his axioms, these things that he could build, this unassailable foundation that he could build. And so he used what he called the method of doubt. And it went something like this. He imagined that he would imagine things about the mind or about himself. And any one of those things, if there was anything about it that could be doubted, he would discard it. So for example, he imagined, I can't trust my senses, because senses can be unreliable. Maybe I'm hallucinating, etc. So can't trust the senses. And he did a series of things like that. He actually decided that he couldn't even trust the existence of the physical world, right? If it hadn't have been the early 1600s, he would have said, well, it's like the movie Matrix. Maybe it's all just a big computer simulation. He even wrote about the possibility of some evil demon who was tricking his senses, and so couldn't trust anything about his senses. And because of that, then, he actually decided he couldn't even fully trust the existence of his own body. And so he goes on for pages and pages of these things he's discarding, and there's this pile of things over here that he's discarded that just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it seems so discouraging, and then finally he strikes upon the thing that you all know. It led to I think, therefore I am. It was actually much more clever than that. He finally, at one point, I think almost out of frustration, said, well, perhaps I can even doubt that I'm doubting. And there, for the first time, he realized he was onto something, that you can't doubt that you're doubting, because that is itself doubting. And so he wrote something like this: we cannot doubt of our existence while we doubt. In another passage, I doubt, therefore I am. That's the brilliancy. You all know the other one, the thing that we all know, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, the one we all know. It's literally, in other words, I doubt, therefore I am, or what is the same, I think, therefore I am. And this was the birth of the philosophy of mind theory of Cartesian dualism, that the mind is somehow different. The mind is different from the body. Descartes argued, I can doubt the existence of my body, but I just proved that I can't doubt the existence of my mind. Now, he went on, his whole thing about proving the soul and all that, talk to your philosophy professors about how that went. And he used this theorem by Leibniz that if for things to be the same, there can be nothing different about them. And he said, well, I can doubt my body, but not my mind. My mind and my body are different. The soul exists. God exists. But philosophers ran with this now, and here's this beautiful foundation for a philosophy of mind that is sort of eerily works and feels good to us. That what we experience, that our minds are somehow different. And this dualism just feels like it works, right? It's hard to imagine that our minds are somehow of the physical world. And so the idea behind dualism then is that there's the mind part of the world, there's the physical world. It obeys the laws of physics, and objects occupy space and all the things we know, but the mind part of the world is different. Maybe it doesn't obey the laws of physics. And so this became one of the most popular theories of mind, and it's contrasted to, there are maybe as many theories of mind as there are theorists working on this, but the main category of the alternative is physicalism, which is, hey, come on, the world's the world, so the mind must be part of the physical world. If we're thinking about the brain, then the brain is the mind. That's that. Okay. Now, each of them, philosophers of mind, will tell you have a problem, something to apologize for. What philosophers call an explanatory gap, which is a fancy word for they don't know that yet. For dualism, the question is, well, if there's these two parts to the world, mind and body, how do they interact, right? So my non-physical mind is deciding to point the laser pointer. Oh, wait, well, my body just did it, right? So the question then is, how did my non-physical mind interact with my body to make that happen? That's the part that dualism struggles with. The part that physicalism struggles with is simply, wait, come on, mind feels different. How do brains give rise to minds? So this is the big debate, and like most philosophical debates, it goes round and round, and there never feels like there's ever going to be an answer. But what I want to do now is show you, we'll just fold in a little bit of neuroscience, and amazingly, we can narrow it down to something that perhaps we can digest. Okay. Now, I'm not going to do a lot. In fact, what I'm going to argue for has a lot of evidence from a lot of different kinds of neuroscience. I'm only going to do it in terms of brain damage, because it's just easy to talk about. Brain damage takes away parts of our minds is the theme. So I'm going to give two examples. They're both famous examples. This is Phineas Gage. So his is a famous story. He had this horrible accident. So it was the late 1840s. He was working. He was mid-20s, responsible guy. He was so responsible. He was the foreman of his crew, laying railroad track through either New Hampshire or Vermont. I can never remember. Working on the east to west version of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the way they did it is that they're blasting through granite, so maybe it was Vermont. So they would drill into the granite, pour gunpowder, and tamp it down with these rods. Well, there was an accident one day where there was a spark, and it shot this rod that he's holding right here with the pointy end first, right through underneath his cheek, behind his eye, through the frontal part of his brain, and out the top. And as you can see, this is him after the accident. He lost his eye. Now, it's kind of remarkable that he survived. He had a horrible infection that took months to go away. The infection probably ravaged parts of his brain too. Now, what ends up then is that a goodly chunk of the front part of his brain, his prefrontal cortex, was gone. So it's remarkable that he survived. It's also remarkable about what parts of his mind didn't go away. So his memory was fine. His IQ was roughly the same. He could understand language. He could talk. His emotions were more or less correct. But there was one really devastating change in him, which was really, you could sum up as his morality. And we know now this to be characteristic of people with damage to prefrontal cortex. They can't control themselves. And so, like other people with the damage like this, he was impulsive and irresponsible, and they're often lewd in unpleasant ways. He would blurt out things about women's bodies right in front of them. It was, just not. It made him completely unemployable. In fact, he wandered around for the 12 years after his accident, and he loved this thing. He often had it with him. He was in a sideshow for a circus for a while. Finally, ended up 12 years later developing severe epilepsy, and he passed away. The point of the story then is that the part of his mind that went away when his prefrontal cortex went away was his self-control or his morality. Now that's a pretty fundamental aspect. If you think about what makes you, that's a pretty important part of it, no? So here's another example. Part of the brain called the parietal lobe. It's about processing sensory information about objects. And when it's damaged, it gives rise to the craziest thing called, and the damage often happens on one side. And so it gives rise to a set of symptoms called parietal hemi-neglect, half neglect. And sometimes it's about objects in the external world. And how it manifests itself is that these people no longer, in this case, in this person's case, no longer understands the idea that objects have a left side. They're not blind. It's hard to describe. They are absent even the notion, as self-evident as it might seem that objects have a left and right side, they're missing one of them. The idea is they only have that idea. It's only self-evident because that part of the brain makes it so. Now, in the really eerie cases, the deficit can be about themselves as an object, and they get something, the neglect is about themselves. They ignore one whole half of their body. And one of the ways this is often diagnosed is he asks people to make self-portraits, and they'll draw something like this. Now, this happens to be a famous artist, Reynold Brown, and he had a stroke like this. He was famous for these really beautiful charcoal portraits. And this is after his stroke. And this isn't him being Picasso-y. This is him drawing a self-portrait. And what it shows is that he is absent the notion that he has a right side. They encounter their own arms on the neglected side. They don't know what it is. Oliver Sacks had a story in one of his first books of this guy who kept falling out of bed. The reason he was is that he had this. He would wake up and encounter his own right arm, which he had no way to process. The best he could come up with, the best explanation he could come up with, is that somebody was playing a horrible practical joke on him and put a cadaver's arm in bed, and he would grab it and throw it out. He would throw himself out of bed. His own right arm was so implausible that he couldn't even guess, well, I don't know, I've got a left arm, maybe I have a right arm. Okay. So I picked these examples because they're odd, and they kind of touch deeply, in the one case, something that we hold quite sort of sacred and valuable. Our morality is kind of a lot about us, and one that shows something that seems utterly self-evident, that of course I have a left and right side. Well, only of course, because you have a part of your brain that makes it obvious and self-evident. So then the idea then, the big idea is every part of your mind is happening somewhere in your brain. Every part of your mind could be lost if that part of the brain, unfortunately, is damaged. Nothing is exempted. Morality is not exempted. Objects have a left and right side, not exempted. Every aspect of your mind is needed. There's a part of your brain that it needs to happen. And so the idea then from neuroscience, quite simply, is that the brain is necessary for mind. Every aspect of your brain, every aspect of your mind, there's a part of your brain that's necessary for it. Nothing exempted. Now, neuroscientists often, I'll confess, get to about here and say, there you go, dualism's wrong, physicalism is right. And if we're trying to be as rigorous as Descartes was, I would propose to you that there is a form of dualism that wouldn't be inconsistent with this. And I made it up myself. I'm going to call it Dualism Prime because I couldn't think of anything else. But here's Dualism Prime. Dualism Prime says there's a mind part of the world and a physical part of the world. The brain is necessary for mind because it's the conduit between the two. The brain's necessary because the mind can't talk to the physical world without the brain. It's the purpose of the brain for the physical world. That's how it communicates with the non-physical mind. That explanation is entirely consistent with the observations that the brain is necessary for mind. And of course, physicalism says the brain's necessary for mind. That's obvious. All right? So what I find interesting then is we take this centuries-old debate about what's our philosophy of mind. We fold in just a little bit of neuroscience and we narrow it down to two options that we can actually test. And so what's interesting then is that necessity, this idea of necessity is not the test. Both physicalism and dualism prime can be consistent with the idea that the brain is necessary for mind. But here's what they disagree. Here's where they disagree. The other big, powerful idea in science, which is sufficiency. So the big question is, that would discriminate between these two is the brain sufficient for mind? So dualism says no. I'll grant you that the brain is necessary for mind because it's the conduit, but it's not sufficient because you need the non-physical part. You need that too. Anything else that you need means that the thing that you're talking about isn't sufficient. Whereas physicalism, by definition, what it states is the brain is both necessary and sufficient. The brain is the mind. And so, these fold in a little bit of neuroscience now, and these two big ideas distill down to this one question that arbitrates between the two of them. Is the brain sufficient for mind as well? And what's fun about that, scientifically, is that scientists have a lot of tricks up their sleeves about how to ask questions of sufficiency. One of the most powerful is to try to recreate the phenomenon. So if you could recreate the phenomenon with the pieces, then you've shown that the pieces are sufficient. Well, asking whether a machine can have a mind is a form of trying to recreate a mind, and so it becomes a question of sufficiency. The question of whether or not we can create a machine that has a mind is like saying, is physicalism right or dualism right? And it can ask, what is it that you need to have a mind? And so I want to, my goal now is that I want to walk you through a series of thought experiments, and we're going to start sort of in a place that's not so scary, and I'm going to take us to some thought experiments that I hope are going to challenge us a bit. But all of the thought experiments are going to be about what's possible and what's not. And I would invite you now, as I propose these thought experiments, I want you to sort of play along. You'll get more out of this if you do the experiment in your head. I'll propose the thought experiment, explain why I think it's interesting, and you think to yourself, yeah, I think that would work or that wouldn't. Okay? And by work, it means would a mind happen if that were true? Okay? So let's start real simple, and to start simple, I just have to give a little primer about neurons in the brain. Keep it simple, but here's the deal. Your brain is made of neurons, about 80 billion of them. They're little electrical devices, and they signal each other. They're all interconnected. So here's a real neuron. This is a neuron of a rat from the part of the brain called the hippocampus. Here's the electrode that was used to fill it with this beautiful fluorescent dye. Here's an artist's rendition of a couple of neurons, and it shows another key concept, which is neurons are connected to one another in a wiring diagram by these things called synapses. And synapses are the way that the electrical signals in one neuron can influence whether or not electrical signals happen in those downstream neurons. And so if the brain is an electrical device, then the neurons are the components, and they're wired together just like all electrical devices. So just a quick thing about what these electrical things look like. So this is a recording from a real neuron in the thalamus, which doesn't matter, but it has unusual properties. So this is voltage. This is the voltage, and you can see that it has these behaviors. It has these things that you can hear, these spiky things. Those are called spikes or action potentials, and this is the language of the brain. When those happen, those are the times when the neuron is signaling to its downstream neurons. So here's the neuron thinking, and then every time you see one of these spikes, you can hear them. This is a trick that neuroscientists love to do. You just connect it to a stereo, and you can hear them. You know, you can be doing the experiment. You can say, oh yeah, the neuron's still firing. Now this neuron's unusual. It has these things called down states and up states. So this is a down state. Obviously, this is an up state. And neuroscientists love to argue what all this is about. The point here is this is just a real pretty example that was recorded by a friend of mine at Yale, Dave McCormick, and he makes them available on the web. So I was able to get it. All right? So what's happening here then is that neurons can generate these signals. They get nudges from other neurons through synapses. Those nudges can drive the voltage down, which makes them less likely to signal. It can drive the voltage up, which would make them more likely to fire bursts like this. It's those bursts, again, when the neuron is communicating with its downstream part. So this is just, the whole brain is like this, 80 billion of these, over 500 trillion of these synapses. All wired together in a clever way, each neuron getting input, doing something like this, generating outputs or not that would look like this. When they generate outputs, it's these signals that travel down the axon or the wire, cause the chemical transmitter to be released, which is the up and down nudges for the one that follows. And so that's the language and the wiring of the brain. Now, the point of all this is that it's not difficult to build mathematical models that behave by these neurons. And I threw this equation up here because I wanted to feel important. But this is indeed the form of an equation that we've known since the late 1940s. And you have about 200 or so different kinds of neurons in your brain. So if we knew enough about every one of those, and we know a lot about maybe 2/3 of them, then it's usually possible to build a mathematical model that will behave exactly like this. What does that mean? Well, if you gave it a pattern of fake inputs, and it behaved exactly the same way, by behave I mean one does it make outputs and one does it not. If it behaves exactly the same way as the real neuron would with that same kind of pattern of inputs, and that's true for all circumstances, then that's a good model of that neuron. It's a mathematical model of that neuron that behaves like the real thing. And it's not that hard to do. Neuroscientists do this all the time. In fact, this equation came from beautiful Nobel Prize-winning work that was done in the 1940s in England. And so we've known the math about this for a long, long time. So then the idea then is that, so here's a real neuron with a different kind of neuron. You can see it kind of behaves differently. Here's a mathematical model, not of this neuron. In fact, I don't even know what kind of neuron this is. I just like the picture. This is a mathematical model of a particular kind of neuron in the part of your brain called the cerebellum. And it's a model that my lab built. And the idea then is that in every way that we've tested it, it behaves like its real counterpart. And so once you have that, then you can start thinking of these are the building blocks then of building a model of the whole brain. We could imagine wiring them together and doing, and this is computational neuroscience, and we'll talk that in a bit. Okay, but now if we have the foundation to start having fun with these thought experiments, and I'm going to start super simple. I thought long and hard about the smallest possible change that we could imagine to one of these things and ask, would that make a difference for a brain? And so here's what I came up with. So it's known, our UT students, neuroscience students know this. Here's one of these spikes drawn on a faster time scale so you can see it. So one of these that lasts about a millisecond is shaped kind of like that. We all know how this works, that there's a lot of sodium ions like seawater outside of neurons and a lot of potassium ions inside of neurons. There's little channels that open and close. When sodium channels open, sodium flows in, it's positive, and so the neuron becomes more positive. They close, potassium channels open, and the neuron, the response goes back down. Sodium in, potassium out. All of these along here in a super fast time scale. Sodium in, potassium out. Sodium in, potassium out. That's how this works. Okay? So imagine this. In a different universe, it could be potassium in and sodium out. Now, the electrical charge on these ions is indistinguishable. And so it could just be in a different world that there happens to be a lot of potassium on the outside of neurons and a lot of sodium on the inside. Rearrange some of those ion channels, and then it could be potassium in and sodium out and get exactly the same shape. Neurons could behave in exactly the same way. So that's simple thought experiment number one. We've rewired how your brain works, and so instead of sodium in and potassium out, it's potassium in and sodium out. But all the signals are the same. Everything's the same otherwise. When I do that thought experiment, I think there's no way that that could make a difference. Okay? So that's game number one. Here's back to normal, sodium in, potassium out. Another one just for fun. What if it starts the other way and it's sodium out and potassium in? All that does is make the signals upside down. So now physiology would look like this. Rearrange a couple of things inside of the cell so that the chemical transmitter is released when the voltage goes down instead of the voltage goes up. And then it's easy. I imagine that all the signals are the same. And everything, and this is another one for me, when I run this thought experiment in my head, I can't imagine how that would make a difference. Okay, so this is just a warm-up. So for any of you, are you already thinking, no, I'm out, my brain would be different, it was that way? Is anybody already there? Okay. We've lost two people already, so you're not going to like what happens next then. Okay, so now we're going to get down to business. We're really going to get after the thought experiments now. So let's imagine that it's the 23rd century. It's a thought experiment. It doesn't have to be plausible right now. It's the 23rd century, and we have this amazing new technology that we'll call neuron replacement therapy, and it works like this. We can take any neuron and we can zap it with a laser and make it go away. And through some amazing new laser printer technique, we can rebuild an artificial neuron exactly the same shape right where it is. And we have the technology that if this is a synapse that releases a particular neurochemical and the real neuron responded to it in a particular way, our little neuron replacement therapy neuron does exactly the same thing. Not only that, but inside of it, there's a little computer that can run our model program, and so that it can respond to its inputs exactly like the real one. And so we can zap away the old neuron and put in its place an artificial neuron that we've engineered so that it behaves exactly like the one that we zapped out. It will respond with exactly the same signals as the original one. Now here's the fun part. Let's think about a couple of neurological diseases that involve neurons that die. So a really horrible one is ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Don't know why, but in ALS, the motor neurons in your spinal cord die. And that leads to the paralysis. If you think of Stephen Hawking before he passed away, the reason he was in a wheelchair is his ALS meant that the motor neurons in his spinal cord had all died. Now, what's bad about that is these neurons, when they make their electrical spikes, those signals travel down your nerves to your muscles, and that's how your muscles twitch. It's these neurons that the brain uses to twitch the muscles to make your movements. Okay, so in the 23rd century then, let's say that there's also a test that you can get that will reveal that you're at risk for ALS down the road. And your physician can come to you and say, we can offer you neuron replacement therapy, and so what we're going to do is use that technology to replace all of the motor neurons in your spinal cord with these copies, and then you'll be impervious to ALS. So thought experiment number one is that would you opt for that? And thought experiment number two then is that this is down in your spinal cord. This is how muscle twitches. Imagine in your thought experiment mode now, does that sound like it would make a difference for you and your personality and who you are and how you move and all that? Okay? It's a cure for ALS, or a prevention for ALS, if nothing else. Another one that's important to me, Parkinson's disease involves the death of neurons called dopamine neurons in a place called the substantia nigra. I care a bit about this. My mom has Parkinson's disease. So in part, these are the green neurons here. They're stained with a fluorescent marker. Those are the dopamine neurons. Those are the ones that die in Parkinson's disease. When these neurons are active, they signal reward to a part of your brain that learns about what's good and what's bad. Should we do this or shouldn't we? It's why Parkinson's patients eventually don't do anything, because that part of the brain is saying nothing's worth it, because dopamine neurons aren't there to say that was good. Same 23rd century thought experiment, another test reveals that you're at risk for Parkinson's disease. The physician offers you neuron replacement therapy. We can go in and zap away all of your dopamine neurons and replace them with fake dopamine neurons. They'll behave the same way. They'll release dopamine, and you'll be impervious to Parkinson's disease and go on learning what's good and what's bad and behaving the way you do. Okay. I hope you can see the game I'm playing. I started in safe-sounding places like the spinal cord in the middle of the brain where nothing's going on, but now the rubber's going to hit the road. Okay, so now we're going to get there. So, Alzheimer's disease. In Alzheimer's disease, one of the first parts of the brain that is affected, the earliest neurons to die, are in the hippocampus. These are a beautiful stain of hippocampal neurons. And in fact, it's these neurons right here, the pyramidal neurons in hippocampus, that are among the earliest to die in Alzheimer's disease. And that's the reason why the earliest symptoms are about memory, about not forming new memories. My dad had Alzheimer's disease. We moved him to Austin. And I felt guilty when we first moved him here. I'd call him and say, "Hey, Dad, I'll pick you up for beer." I'd show up and knock on the door, and my dad'd say, "Mike, what a surprise, good to see you." So I soon learned that there was no point making that phone call, because he couldn't form a new memory that Mike called. He had all of his old memories because that wasn't affected, but he couldn't form new memories like, "Mike just called, I should grab my jacket because he'll be here shortly." All right? It worked out really well. I could lie to him over and over again. He'd say, "When am I going to get my car?" I said, "Next week, Dad." And I could use, for a year, every week, I gave him that answer because he didn't remember that the 43 previous weeks I had told him the same lie. So it works to advantages as well. But when those neurons die, you lose this ability to stamp in new long-term memories. All right? Now, later on, as the Alzheimer's disease worsens, neurons in the cerebral cortex start to die. Now you start having severe cognitive abilities. You're disoriented and unaware, and finally, so bad that you're kind of a vegetable, and then you pass away eventually. Okay? Same thought experiment now, just the stakes are a lot higher. So 23rd century test, you're at risk for Alzheimer's disease. Would you like neuron replacement therapy for hippocampal neurons and cerebral cortex neurons? Okay. The trouble is now is it sounded safe when it was in the spinal cord, because that's twitching muscles. But now this is you. This is cognition. This is your consciousness. This is forming new memories. So it's a lot tougher thought experiment to process through, right? So imagine your answer for that one now. And then here's my biggest thought experiment at all. And what I'm going to do now for our most demanding thought experiment is I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit on this technology. So it's the late 22nd century now, apparently. And we can do this. Neuron Replacement Therapy 1 is available. And same thing, you can laser zap away the neuron and laser printer a new one in there. And it can respond to the neurochemicals that the real one did. It can release neurochemicals onto the downstream cells just like the real one did. But the weak part of the technology is we can't squeeze that computer inside of that little thing. So Neuron Replacement Therapy 1, this version, it has a little 22nd century Bluetooth thing, and it communicates every time it gets an input, it communicates over a Bluetooth to a computer in your pocket. And the computer in your pocket is running those little mathematical algorithms for how does that neuron behave, and Bluetoothing the answer back to release transmitter when the fake neuron is active, when it's not. Now, the idea is that all the signals would be the same. When the real neuron would have spiked, this model neuron would spike. When it's quiet, the real neuron was quiet, this one would be quiet. But now it's not happening in situ. It's not happening right there. It's happening in a computer in your pocket. So now how do you feel about the thought experiment? And would you be you in that circumstance? And then the last one, the coup de grace, as my dad used to say, is as long as we could do that, we could just put the whole brain in the computer. Why bother with the Bluetooth? And the point for all of that then is that's not so different what neuroscientists do when they build computer models of the brain. Is they build model neurons like this that behave like the real one. We don't have this 22nd, 23rd century technology for laser zap things, and we can't do it for real. But you can put millions of those models inside of a computer and run a little algorithm that says who's connected to who, and that algorithm is designed to perfectly mimic the wiring as we understand it in the real brain. And then you can ask, does my computer model behave like the part of the brain that I'm trying to emulate? So in fact, this is part of what I do in my research, starting in the early 1990s with computers that were way too slow for doing this. We started building computer simulations of the cerebellum, a part of your brain that's important for not for consciousness, fortunately, but for motor coordination. And this is an output screen of one of our older, smaller simulations. This simulation is comprised of about 13,000 artificial neurons and about 250,000 virtual synapses, all designed to try to mimic a little piece of the real cerebellum. And we've used these simulations as a sufficiency experiment. We build into these. You have no idea how many hours I have spent the time. I had hair when we started doing this experiment. But it's a sufficiency test. We're doing the same thing. When neuroscientists build simulations like that, here's what we're doing. We're saying, let's take the sum knowledge of the cerebellum that's in the field, and let's build it into these models and put it in our simulation. And we have ways of testing whether it's working well or not. And it's a sufficiency test. If we understand the cerebellum, then our model should behave like the real cerebellum. When it doesn't, which it didn't for a long time, it's still useful in the sense that it can provide a hint about maybe what's missing. All through the early 2000s, my go-to seminar when people invited me to come speak was basically discoveries that we made grappling with the ways that our simulations failed. So even when they failed, we'd sit around and go, why is it failing? And there's a whiteboard and a whole bunch of smart students, and somebody said, have you thought of this? Holy cow. And next thing you know, we're doing a better experiment than we would have done otherwise. So that's the neuroscience of it. But just to put a little concreteness on this, so things like this are going on now. Now, this is the cerebellum. You don't think with your cerebellum. But one of the reasons I got into this topic, one of the reasons I teach this Building Brains course, one of the reasons why I want to write about a book about this one day, is I've sat for hours and hours staring at this screen, noticing the little intricacies about whether the simulation was behaving like the real cerebellum or not. And I can't help but wonder someday, down the road, somebody like me with hair is going to be building computer simulations of the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that we think with, the part of the brain that we think gives rise to self-awareness. And that's going to be a whole different ball of wax than this, right? Because I'm safe from that because we don't think with our cerebellum. All these squigglies just say that we understand the cerebellum well enough to know a thing or two about how it helps coordinate our movements. Okay. So just to give you an idea, 1990s, we could simulate 10,000 neurons at 1/500th real time. What that meant is it took overnight. If we wanted to simulate 10 seconds worth of cerebellum doing something, it took all night to run it. Right about the time that I moved to UT Austin, we were transitioning from 12,000 neurons real time, meaning it ran 500 times faster, to thank you, NVIDIA and GPUs and gamers who made all this possible. Now we can run these things with big parallel several thousand processors. Right now we can run about 4 simulations with about 4 million fake neurons real time. So 5 seconds of life takes 5 seconds to calculate. We're about to build, just coming January, we're going to build a new one that we think we can do 60 million neurons. When we get to 100 million, we can simulate one little part of the cerebellum. When we get to 40 billion, then we can simulate the whole human cerebellum. But you notice how this thing's ramping up. In my daughter's lifetime, it'll be possible to simulate an entire cerebellum and ask, hey, cerebellum field, how do we understand the cerebellum well enough to build one? So, but down the road then it's not going to be the cerebellum. Down the road we may have to grapple with things like building simulations of parts of the brain that could think or talk to us or say, please don't turn me off. And people have already anticipated that there may be ethical issues with that. It's interesting to see every one of these movies. So there's an episode of Star Trek Next Generation where somebody wants to disassemble Data, and they have a trial to see if he has, as a machine, he has a right to say no. Of course, in Blade Runner, the whole idea was that was Rachel an android or a person? And if she was an android, then Harrison's Ford character should have killed her. Lots of ethical things going on. Here the androids are trying to escape because they don't like being imprisoned in the place where they were invented. Isaac Asimov, the whole thing with the iRobot was the 3 laws of robots. You know, they were endowed with a morality, but then the morality went wrong because humans treated them so badly. Of course, if any of you watch West Wing, holy cow, you know, ethical issues abound in that. So there'll be that part of it. So here's a summary of what we did. So we started with the question, can a machine have a mind? And we used this idea of thought experiments that we can't do, but even just imagining them can help us think about things. I hope you did a few thought experiments. I hope you have some answers in your head. I hope you write me about, if you have strong feelings about some of the results that you imagined in your thought experiments. Maybe you and your partner will argue about your results on the way home. That would be a win for me if things like that happen. So look at the things that it touches. So it can touch your personal philosophy of mind, right? So, am I all in my brain, or is there something beyond my brain that's required for my mind? That's the whole idea of, we saw how dualism versus physicalism, this huge centuries-long debate in philosophy of mind, fold in a little neuroscience and it becomes one question. Is the brain's necessary for the mind? Is the brain sufficient for mind? That's the difference between dualism and physicalism. Now, I have to say, in closing, I was listening to a lecture one time, a lecture on tape. I was driving to Woods Hole, Massachusetts, where I used to teach in the summer, and it's a 3-day drive. I had a bevy of books on tape with me. I had this whole series on philosophy. My daughter's in the front row. She's shaking her head going, Dad, really? You could have done, like a novel. But anyway, here's this philosopher, and here's what this philosopher said. Philosophers tackle the hard questions that science can't. And I'm leaning forward in my seat. I'm about to drive off the road. So like I'm mumbling to myself, you have no idea how hard, and I'm just about to bow up on this guy and say, what are you talking about? And he completed his thought. And he said, what I mean by that is that when science discovers a way to study something, then it's no longer philosophy, it becomes science. Psychology used to be a philosophy. And then people figured out how to systematically study behavior, and the philosophy of behavior became psychology, the science of behavior. And so I think one of my main points tonight then is as computational neuroscience kicks in and we start asking these questions like, do our models behave like the real brain or parts of the brain? I would propose to you that philosophy of mind is transitioning into a science of mind, where we can answer these questions. Can a machine have a mind, being the fulcrum point for most of the important ones? And, hopefully Descartes would be thrilled that we're still talking about this. And hopefully, I still sort of hope, but before I get too old to notice things, that something like this is invented and we can all sit around and debate whether it should exist and what's cool about it. So anyway, thank you for your attention.